Pleasure to follow on from my colleague from the Justice and Electoral Committee and also speak to this bill, which we were both members of the Select Committee that considered this bill. And I will acknowledge that it was considered in a very brief amount of time, primarily because it was perceived within the Select Committee to be reasonably uncontroversial, and of course there was one submission. But I just want to come back to basically the first principles, which Paul Quinn did touch on briefly in his contribution. The first principles of this legislation, which is an omnibus piece of legislation, but in conjunction with the primary legislation, the goal of both was to enhance, I believe, confidence, public confidence in the judiciary, which I think is quite a critical thing, as I do believe it's critical that people have faith in the politicians they democratically elect. And not only was it to enhance public confidence in the judiciary, but to ensure that there were adequate resource to meet the growing workload of the judiciary. And I don't think any of us can deny that it is that is the case. We did only have one submission to the Judicial Matters Bill, and that was from Chief Justice Dame Sian Elias, who made a submission after consultation with the President of the Court of Appeal and Chief High Court Judge. And they were in support of the bill and made a few short suggestions to the bill itself. And I just want to touch on the bill as it was reported back to the House from the Select Committee. There was one small recommendation that we made. We recommended inserting clause 12A, which would amend section 17(1) of the Judicial Conduct Commissioner and Judicial Conduct Panel Act. And that was to clarify that where the Commissioner has exercised his or her power to take no further action on a complaint, the Commissioner is not required to then refer that complaint back to the head of bench. And I think that's an acknowledgement that although what is key in all of this is that we have this system in place, there are going to be situations by the very nature of our justice system that people may use this complaints process to complain about a judgment as opposed to the conduct of the judge presiding over the court at that time. So we were mindful of the fact that there is a balance to be struck, that although this mechanism is key and important, we do not wish it to be unnecessarily bureaucratic. And I will come back to a few of the figures around how frequently this process has been used since its introduction, I believe, in 2004. But before I do that, I do want to come back to some comments that have been made by my colleagues in this House, not just this afternoon, but when this bill was first introduced. In fact, I want to go all the way back to the July of 2008, the first reading, I believe, of this bill, in which a member of the National Party stated clearly and uncategorically, and I quote, "This bill will not be supported by the National Party. The material dealing with the Deputy Judicial Conduct Commissioner is as misconceived as the contents of the substantive legislation." So not only the amendment, but the whole notion of this process, this backstop measure, this measure of confidence, was something they stood against. Secondly, although National has great respect for associate judges and the work they do, simply increasing their number is not the answer. Reforming the civil justice system is the answer. Of course, this government not only does not know the answers, it is so hopeless that it does not even know which questions to ask. I have a question to ask. If the key to everything, including reforming deeming the Judicial Matters Bill to be unnecessary, was to reform the civil justice system, why have we not seen that bill come before the House yet? Perhaps that's on the work programme for some time in the future. Instead, they decided to support the Judicial Matters Bill because, of course, just for clarity's sake, I am in fact reading Chris Finlayson's first reading speech. Those were his comments where he clearly and uncategorically spoke against this bill, and I would be very interested to hear from him further down the track as to why he has changed his mind on this bill. I would be genuinely interested. My colleague is right, we did not get that in his substantive speech. I would be interested to hear further from him. In fact, I've got a couple of follow-on questions for him, which I'll throw out now while I'm reviewing his words. He also said that He saw this as an unwarranted attack on judicial independence and that it would encourage ineffective and stupid complaints. In fact, that it would encourage a culture of complaints. So we should not have any ombudsman in this country because then people might just complain to them. Well, I added the ombudsman remark, but his final statement I'll read again was, in fact, it would encourage a culture of complaints. And he went on to say, and colleagues of mine, like Judith Collins, who spoke about the legislation, were indeed prophetic because it has basically been a waste of time. We were right to oppose this legislation in 2004 and we're right to oppose this amendment bill, the Judicial Matters Bill. Now, we have, of course, had a select committee process. That may have been the time, perhaps even as a minister, he could have withdrawn this bill from the order paper. It hasn't happened. I would be interested to know why, given the strength of feeling that's coming through in this speech.
Well, they're flip-flopping over.
It does appear, as my colleague says, to be a flip-flop. Or perhaps, I do want to give the minister the benefit of the doubt, perhaps he has had new information before him that has substantively changed his mind, and I think the House would really benefit from hearing that information. And he did have just one more point specifically on the Deputy Commissioner. We do not see any need for a Deputy Commissioner. In fact, we do not see any need for a Commissioner. I noted from the Commissioner's report that it was said it would be helpful to have a Deputy because of conflict of interest. But Dr. Worth has dealt with that. This person does not need a deputy because the prospect of conflict of interest is minimal. Now, I'm sorry, but in my mind, that is not good enough. Saying that the prospect of conflict of interest is minimal and therefore there is no need for a commissioner at all, I think would again undermine that first principle of ensuring that we can all have faith in our judiciary. Now, this is something that's consistently raised when we talk about the criminal justice system and our judiciary generally in New Zealand, that we are a small country. It was the argument that was made by some people in order to claim that we should maintain the Privy Council. Right. It was because we were too small to maintain our own truly independent judiciary, and we couldn't do it on our own. Those were the kinds of arguments that were made probably by people who considered themselves to be also royalists perhaps as well. But this is the kind of thing that we put in place even to pay heed to that to acknowledge, yes, we are a small country, but we do have the depth and the knowledge and the experience in our judiciary to be entirely independent, but we should put in safety measures as well so that we can ensure the public has faith and trust in our system. I don't care if there are 2, 3 or no cases of a conflict of interest for a commissioner at any one time. If that is a significant enough amount in my mind to ensure that we have the right people in place, and if that includes a deputy commissioner to assist, then I think that is something worth doing in order to maintain the faith in the system. And I do just want to reflect on the fact that in 2009, the Judicial Conduct Commissioner reported that the number of complaints dealt with about judges in the year to July had increased from 132 to 189. Now, according to Chris Finlayson, they only exist because there's an ability to complain. That's the only reason there are actually complaints to be heard. This included 139 new complaints, 50 carried over from the previous year, so obviously worth consideration. And the number of complaints against High Court judges increased from 19 to 44 and the Family Court from 13 to 27. Now, we have to acknowledge that some of those, again, would have been frivolous, but 4 complaints were significant enough to be referred to the head of bench to deal with, compared to just 2 in the previous year, and the grounds for some of those were rudeness, unfairness, inappropriate remarks, failure to listen, bias and predetermination. I think significant enough grounds to ensure that we have at least a mechanism in place to consider those complaints on behalf of New Zealanders. And of course, I do briefly just want to mention that last year we did have a story about there in December of 2009, a story of a judge being the first to go before the conduct panel when it was found that details of a financial relationship that the judge had when presiding over a case that a Queen Counsel appeared where he owed that individual $250,000. That is the kind of situation where I believe it is important, again, we have this mechanism in place so that if there is a clear conflict of interest that hasn't been adhered to, that hasn't been dealt with appropriately, there is a mechanism in place to deal with that. I commend this bill to the House.